Okay, so next up we have Alan Mukoki. Alan, you here? There you are. Welcome. Alan has many years of experience working as a senior executive, board-level executive at many of the companies we know, Danell, Kula, Nedbank, the Land and Agricultural Bank. He's the CEO of the South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry. He's a graduate of Oxford University, and he is well equipped to be our keynote address today. Thank you, Alan.
Ngiyabonga Mgcinisihlalo. Ngicela ukubingelela umongameli uSifiso Falala. Ngibingelele futhi nomongameli owakushiyela ibele umnumzana uJoe Otin nawe ngqongqoshe jikelele. Kuthiwa ke ngesizulu pheqelezi uExecutive Director uJennifer Daniel nabo bonke abantu abakhona la ekhaya namhlanje izimeli zeinkampani ezihlukahlukene nezinhlangano ezithize. With those few remarks, Mr. President, I've managed to do 4 things. 1, I've managed to create the level of discomfort that has raised the collective blood pressure in this room, a number of decibels higher. Number 2 and number 3, I've managed to do 2 things. You know, they say there's a difference between a thermostat and a thermometer. The thermostat sets the temperature and the thermometer measures it. I've done that. And lastly, Mr. President, I've got everyone's attention. So I've done well. So we can start this talk. So to those who are less educated, I was simply greeting the President, his predecessor, the executive director that I called in Sizulu, Ungqongqoshe Jikelele. If you don't know how to do the tricks, that's not my fault. The problem is with your education, not me. But we're here now, and thank you so much for the opportunity for us to come and do our little presentation about, I looked at the program in respect of what you wanted to discuss around investing in Africa in particular. That became an area that we were more interested in. And early this morning, so my wife was asking me, what time is your conference starting? I said at 9. She says, at 9? I said, yeah, at 9. She says, which 9? I said, what do you mean, which 9? She says, black 9 or white 9? And, and I have to say this because a number of years ago, Sting, you all know Sting. I see the ages in this room, you should know Sting. Formerly of the police, he was performing at the Dome in South Africa, a big concert venue. And the CEO of the Dome happens to be a partner to my wife. And generally when there's a concert there, I'm always saying, what time is the concert? I ask my wife, and she says the concert starts at 9. So I say, no, I'm not going there at 9, because most times when I go there, that concert starts at 10. I was there for Lionel Richie, Earth, Wind and Fire, Chris Brown, all these people, nothing started on time. So on this occasion, when Sting was actually performing, and my wife keeps saying, let's go, let's go. I say, what time is the concert? She says, it starts at 7. I say, okay, so I think we can leave right about 8. She says, but you always want to go late. I say, no, you know what happens there. So we went to this concert, and by 7:15, all the white people were sitting down. At 6:30, walks in with his guitar. He sits down and he's setting up, and this guy's about to play. My wife looks at me and says, you see, I told you, this is a white concert. You must always be on time. So anyway, so let's try and have this conversation, and thank you, President and Executive Director, because quite clearly this is a white thing. You're all starting on time here, and everything is going to run very, very smoothly indeed. There is an old African saying that says that only a man who crosses the river at night knows the value of the light of day. May I repeat that? Only a man who crosses the river at night knows the value of the light at the light of day. We, as an institution or as a South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry, were at the intersection between public policy, business, and society in general. This is the work that we do. We go and engage government and big labor and big community groups in the area of policy, regulation, legislation. You name it, we're there. National health, insurance, we go there to talk about the impact that that kind of policy is going to have on business. And these are only opening remarks because we're going to now talk about Africa. It's about the 4 Ps. And what we mean by that, it's people, it's purpose, it's the politics, and then it's policy. And the people in my office are always reminding me that you should get them in that order. Don't mix them. It's people first, followed by purpose, followed by the politics, because the politics define what the policy is actually going to be. And we sit at that level of intersection so that we can have these very critical debates about what exactly it is that needs to happen. As Saki ourselves, of course, we're very much focused on economic growth and what the opportunity and potential of Africa actually means. And we're very excited about that particular opportunity. But as you know, there's a lot of noise. And when you work with politicians, it's a combination between mystery, mythology, and mysticism. And that's why organizations such as yourselves, who are at the crux of working with data, with science, become so critical in enabling this particular conversation to be moved to a higher level, so that we don't base things on mythology, we don't base things on ideology, we don't base things on what Karl Marx told us so many years ago, or what Adam Smith says, that we can work with data that is available today to see how we can solve the problems of society as they pertain to our environment today, and in particular to Africa. And in that context, of course, we're always going to disagree. We're going to have views that are very different from each other, so long as we can substantiate with science, whether you went with quants, whether you went with qualitative, whether you went ethnographic, but there is a base and a framework that you're working with that says, I believe I can take this particular decision because it's based on some kind of sound research or sound thinking around what it is that needs to be done. In South Africa, and I see in many of the regimes in Africa, the idea of constitutionalism has now taken root, where the fundamental nature of the state has to be a constitutional state. And it's very difficult to now do a coup in Africa these days, and the Zimbabweans will tell you what happened recently, because organizations like the African Union are not actually going to allow you to do that, because the idea of a constitution is important. And fundamental to the constitution is the idea of the Bill of Rights, and human rights is a very centerpiece thereof. Why am I saying that? There's a very old Nguni saying that says that, ukubheda kwendoda akusho ukuthi sangene. Okay, so I'm getting those eyes again, President, so we'll get there. And what this says is that whilst the Constitution, for instance, of the Republic of South Africa guarantees you your freedom of expression, this Nguni saying goes higher than that in terms of its tertiary implication. What it says, literally, it says that just because another man is talking nonsense does not mean they are insane. In other words, you have an obligation to listen, even if you don't agree with the person on the other side. Your right is not just to speak, it's an obligation to hear the other view. Seek first to understand before you can be understood. Now, you need to pay attention to this part. This is going to be very important today. If you're going to have a walk away today from this speech, this is the only one. The rest of it, you can ignore me and work on your phones and do anything. This saying goes with another saying in Zulu. It says that, kuye kubanjiswane uma kuchatwa uhlanya. Yo. Okay, so in African traditional medicine, if you lose your mind, you go insane for whatever reason, we don't take you to a psychiatrist. We find the local African traditional healer who believes very strongly that there are small little animals that are running around in your head that are making you to lose your mind. You therefore need to be cured the African way. And that African way will include giving you an enema to get rid of these animals that are inside you, spiritual animals that are making you to lose your mind. So what this saying says, means when you give someone who is mad an enema, you both need to hold that person because they are not necessarily going to cooperate with you. Such is the problem that we face which is Africa today, around the issues of development. So, this is very important. And therefore, in this conversation, we then talk about what are these things that we all agree need to be conditions precedent that need to be met for the development of Africa. We don't design the framework. There are all these organizations internationally, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, the IMF, and everybody else. And I think that in a sense, people have agreed that there are two views in the world. Is the academic theory on one side, which is, I suppose that's what most of you work with, and then is the practitioner's viewpoint on the other side. Insofar as who is looking into Africa as it concerns investment, and people who want to put in their money, people are going to go into particular frameworks or agreed theories of development. There is this one thing called the World Economic Forum, where we all go every beginning of the year to Davos, and we hear all these people in politics and business and other leaders of society, and we come to engage with the big issues that face society. And one of those templates happens to be the so-called Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. As part of the work that the World Economic Forum does, they produce a document every year which is called the Global Competitiveness Index Report. Now, this is the report, obviously, that says this is how we rank countries. When we want to do an investment in a country, we're going to look at these following things. And they look at about 12 pillars, and I'll put all of them up there. And I'm not going to speak on all of them because I only have the 30 minutes that's been allocated to me. Pillar number one is institutions. You'll see things like infrastructure, and I'll spend a bit of time on that. There's a pillar number 4, which is health and primary education. There's a pillar number 5, which is higher education and training. And there's number 10, which is market size, and number 12, which is innovation. These are the things that our countries are measured on in respect of how competitive they are to attract investment so that we can drive the development that is required. We didn't design this. I'm saying that the people who come together, the World Economic Forum, have designed that. So if you want to punch at the right weight level as Africans, you need to then be able to have strategies that fulfill that particular mandate to the extent that research organizations like yourselves need to play in that particular space, because these are the issues that are going to be facing African economies. South Africa used to be ranked number 47 out of about 140 countries in the world. And we lost that ranking due to all the problems that we faced. And I think we're sitting somewhere around number 61. Still better ranked, of course, than many African environments. But these are the things that become important. And what do we mean by institutions? Institutions that support constitutional democracy, that underpin the constitutional state. In South Africa, for instance, we've got institutions under Chapter 9 of the Constitution, such as the National Prosecuting Authority, the Independent Electoral Commission, the judiciary. You've got things like the Public Protector, for instance. As a result, you'll notice that a lot of the political noise in South Africa comes largely because of the action that relates to what these Chapter 9 institutions have actually done. What's measured is not whether you've got problems. What's measured is whether those institutions are strong enough as a bulwark against things that happen that are wrong. So South Africa, I think we had a president, all of you know him, Mr. Jacob Zuma, who just left office, you know. And in a way, 50 years from now, we'll probably thank him, not for the right reasons, for other reasons, for the right reasons actually, because he inadvertently took a lot of decisions to challenge the Constitution, and those actions that he took found that the institutions of the state were strong enough to push back very, very, very hard. And because most times, if Zuma or the ANC had to go to court, they would actually lose their court cases because the judiciary is very independent. And the public protector, the previous public protector, at least in terms of narrative, was strong enough to say, you will pay back the money, and it doesn't really matter who you are because I have this particular office, and the Constitutional Court was able to support that. These are the things that become very important around institutions. And infrastructure, I'll come to that later. And the fourth pillar, of course, is the area of health and primary education. And someone was asking, why did you put health and primary education? In South Africa, the Department of Health with the United Nations ran a study about 6, 7 years ago, and they looked at something like 3 million kids, and they were looking for 3 things. Speech, they were looking at hearing, and they were looking at eyesight. So invariably, a lot of these kids who come from all these rural areas, they go to school. So a kid who is deaf does not actually know that they're deaf. So they go into this class, and they don't hear really well what's happening, and everybody says this child does not hear. Actually, it's true, literally, they don't actually hear. Only they don't know that they don't hear, because what they are hearing is the only world that they know of. Some kids sit in class, in the middle of the class, what they cannot see, what they see on that board is what their reality is. They don't know that they actually do not see. And they get put at the back of the class, and they fail that class, and they're taken out of that particular system. Some kids have got speech-related issues, but they don't know that. People say that this child does not get stuff, so they're trying to express themselves. The brain is moving at a speed which is higher than the speech. And again, they get taken to the back of the class. So that's a developmental issue. So when the UN and South African Health Department ran the study, they found that 1/3 of these 3 million kids had one or more of these conditions. That's a serious issue, big issue. Because what are we doing when we invest in primary schooling and health? We're making these kinds of mistakes. And there are many, many, many issues and opportunities around what is happening in the area of health. That goes for higher education and training. So in moving, therefore, as SACI, we say that it's an important issue for us to be involved with the idea of inclusive economic growth and job creation. Under the Mbeki years in South Africa, clearly the economy was growing at 5%, but it didn't actually create any jobs whatsoever. So the idea, therefore, of equity becomes very important in driving the types of policies in Africa that are going to be inclusive. It doesn't help anyone that the people who are rich continue to make money at the total exclusion of the masses throughout Africa. That is unsustainable development. It is not sustainable development because it comes with political instability and the risks become very huge. So we can't drive economies where we've excluded all these people because they are black, or we've excluded all these people because they happen to be women. So we need to be able to build. As you saw in the previous slide, the idea of market size under number 10 is very significant. So the idea that we're raising with big corporations and people who are involved is that the issue of transformation of inclusivity is not a compliance regulatory issue. It is a business opportunity. Because instead of Standard Bank having 10 million credit cards, they can actually have 25 million. All that they needed to do is to invest more money in the development of this huge black market, get more women working, get them to gain high levels of income, et cetera, and voila, now you have a bank that is 4 times its size just in the domestic market alone. And you repeat that throughout Africa, you start creating the type of play that is very, very significant. It's very, very important. All these governments are struggling today with the issue of economic growth, and the new thinking driven by people at the CDI from Harvard is now economic growth can only be driven by us diversifying our economies on the one side. And number 2, looking at the new index, not now the global competitive index, but the new index that they're referring to as the economic complexity index, which emphasizes 2 aspects. Number 1, the extent of the know-how in that particular economy in terms of skills and competencies. And then number 2, in respect of the adaptability and flexibility of those particular skills to be able to migrate even within the same economy on how you can actually do that. So if you're making a shirt, the people who are doing CMT, cut, make, and trim, they need to have deep set skills in knowing how to source, how to cut, how to make the fabric, how to yarn, spin, and then how to make it, and they must have global skills in that particular environment. So that's what this economic growth model now says. Other than that, the business as usual is not necessarily doing anything for us at this particular point in time. The second piece, of course, is the political and economic development in Africa, and we just signed recently the Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is going to create an amazing opportunity. There are still issues that are being discussed, because this was signed only about last month or so, relating specifically to where you've got big African countries like South Africa, which is the most advanced industrially speaking, You cannot go and overrun other countries like Zambia, for instance, in certain product sets. We need to drive the level of research and information and data that is needed to be able to engage in this particular level of development. Because right now, as I said, mysticism and mythology is not going to take us anywhere. We need to have the data that is telling us what is happening in all these environments. So it's very, very important to make sure. I think that the African Union has done a lot of work on the political front. You've got a lot of governance that is now part of the system. What is not yet happening is the economic development, which is so critical in driving where we should actually be going forward. We then talk about the piece of infrastructure. So if you go to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, you will find that infrastructure is one of the fundamental pieces that are very, very critical in driving economic development and investing in Africa. South Africa, for instance, is the most electrified country in Africa, about 85%, and most of it is the old South Africa. And the rest of Africa is only electrified to the extent of 5%. About, depending who you're talking to, I'm sure if I talk to Pamro, they'll give me a different number. You talk to the UN or the World Bank, but it's anywhere between 1 billion and 1.2 billion people in this particular continent. So it's a huge, exciting market in respect of the things that can be done. But for us to be able to tap that particular market, having fixed the values, having fixed the constitutionalism of the political state, and having fixed the issues that relate to how we do the trade amongst each other, we then need to deal with the big, well, people always say the big elephant in the room. I call it the big gorilla in the room, right? So if you play golf, you'll know the guys who hit very long, we call them the gorilla, you know, he hits far. So we need to deal with the issues of the big gorilla in the room, and that issue relates largely to what we refer to as the 5 lines to heaven. Number one, we need to have the grid lines. Many of our environments have got the black stuff, which is coal in South Africa and many other environments in the ground, but there is no infrastructure around the grid lines. And across all the 3 categories of infrastructure, which is generation, assets, transmission, as well as distribution, you need to be able to put it, because that is a mega opportunity. I'll give you an example. There is the Inga project in the DRC, which has the potential to generate something like 40 gigawatts of power, and that can power the entire Southern African region for generations to come. It's cheap, it's green, and it's good, and it's available. Okay, South Africa actually was offered 10 gigs of that power at about $10 billion, but instead we decided to go and build the 2 mega projects of Kusile and Medupi, which cost us more and are still not operating properly at optimum at this particular point in time. Yeah? So we need to build the grid lines, and then we need to build the natural gas. Why natural gas is important is because it's available, it's green, it's cheap, it's available. If you go to Algeria, we can power the entire African continent for years, even Nigeria, for crying out loud. They can power the entire West African region for generations to come on natural gas. Why is it not happening? Is because the infrastructure does not exist to be able to do that. South Africa, Eskom, our power utility, is one of the biggest polluters in Africa in terms of CO2 emissions. We did sign a COP21 environmental agreements, and quite clearly we need to get out of coal so that we can power things with the right thing. So that's a mega opportunity. Jobs are going to be created. And then we do need to build the rail lines. And it's a very fascinating subject. If you go to South Africa, about 25,000 kilometers is rail. So we need to build the 10 million kilometers of rail throughout the continent. So we need to appoint a rail czar to be able to do that, and we need to generate the trillions of dollars of investment and the mega jobs that can come in doing that and wire this entire continent. The British put together something called HS&2 about 3-4 years ago. They said it's going to cost them $50 billion. And this train is moving at 432 kilometers per hour from London. It will break into Manchester and Leeds, right? So we're not talking about things that are not there. We're talking about things that are there. We need to have the ideas to do that. And I'm not talking about Cecil John roads, but we need to power the entire continent so that we can do what? We can move goods and we can move people. Whilst Africa is the richest continent in the world, many of these countries are actually landlocked. So the potential is not being achieved, because if you're going to be generating copper in Zambia and it's going to cost you another $20, $50 to move it to any port, then you become very much uncompetitive. But with rail systems being there and the infrastructure being built around rail, that particular opportunity is going to be very massive. Fourthly, water and sanitation. Like, I've got a friend who does this marketing and communications for McDonald's. And he was saying to me, did you know, McDonald's, the master franchise license for the whole of Africa used to be owned by the president of South Africa. He sold it to a crowd out in the UAE for 2.8 billion. I don't know who advised him to do that, but he did. Anyway, long and short of the story, that is an African license. He was now telling me McDonald's are running, I don't know, 145, 148 shops in South Africa. And this little tomato sauce that you use on your chips, all of it is actually being imported. Yes, it is. And even the furniture that is in all the McDonald's shops that you see in South Africa, all of that is actually being imported. And why we talk about this, we did an MOU with the Zambia Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and the then Minister Margaret was Commerce, Trade and Industry, was giving a keynote to the Hyatt in Johannesburg. And I remember one walk away, she said, did you know that Zambia actually has 40% of the entire water resource of the SADC region, yet 80% of that water ends up in the Indian Ocean as waste? That entire Great Lakes region is ripe for investment in agri and agri-processing. We can feed the entire world. But the investment in water and sanitation is not there, so it needs to be driven so that we can do that. And lastly, fiber optic telecom lines. So we need to build the high-speed fiber optic lines so that it's very quick and fast to be able to engage and communicate. Remember, under Pillar 5 of the World Economic Forum Global Competitiveness Index report slide, I show the area of higher education and training. Now here's the thing. When we talk about the new Economic Complexity Index that emphasizes skills, we need to be able to drive the education. All of you, some of you, I don't know the ages of people here, but some of you will know of apps like Coursera, course with an RA at the end. 127 universities came together and they are putting content for free online. Now this content for free, if you look at it, I did a course with Coursera. It was done by Yale University, 9 weeks. You need 5 hours of contact with the classroom, in other words, via video. 1 hour, it's an HDMI video. 1 hour will cost you about 2.1 gigs in the context of that to it, so it's very expensive. So when we talk to the telcos, they say, no, your government needs to release the telecom spectrum, which is sitting with the public broadcaster, so that we can reduce the cost of data. So we're talking about things that we have that just require a decision. And if you do that, right, that 2 gigs of data will cost you less than 5 rand. And then we can unleash this opportunity. And for the first time, a number of universities are now loading proper degrees, online degrees on Coursera. Michigan University, one of the top IT schools in the United States, has an MSc in data science on Coursera. So people can actually study. We can then drive this idea of higher education and training online if we have the infrastructure. In rural areas, we can go in there with satellite, and there are companies like Gondwana who are actually doing great work in that particular regard. So that's very, very critical. I hope you can see this. I'm not going to talk about all of this due to time. As we talk about creation of these opportunities, we need governments that are actually going to be agile. And what are they dealing with? They are going to be dealing with this, is a spider web, President, I'm sure. These are the things that are going to be very important. Do we have the composure, do we have the skills, do we have the attitude? Last night at dinner, I think Mr. Otin was busy telling people every time they say something, he looks at them and he says, it's culture. And so I was sitting there watching all of this drama unfold in front of my eyes. So he allows them, they say a lot of things, and he says, but it's culture. And I hope that everybody caught up to what it means, because that's what culture is going to determine. Inside that box, we've got a reign of uncertainty. And I just used my stylus pen on my iPad to just draw those 7 lines around global risk, geopolitics, climate change, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence and robotics, infrastructure, real estate, financial and monetary systems. And on the other side is migration and civic participation. It was one of the debating points last night. People were talking about what's happening in South Africa, and the new president has come in, and a simple politics 101 less for those who have an interest in South African politics is that the ruling party, which is the ANC, in the 2009, I think, elections, when they took out the former president Mbeki, the people who voted for the ANC were 11.8 million, 11.5, 11.8 million, you can keep me honest. But the political party itself still had less than 350,000 members. Even today, they still have less than 1 million members of a 57 million country. We talk about civic participation. Don't blame Zuma for your own errors. If you're apathetic, you don't participate in the branch where things are happening. And many of the ANC branches fail to correct to form their own PGMs. And that's why every time you take the ANC to court, you win. So they fail to correct. So effectively, you are saying that 600,000 people are running the country for 57 million people because people are not participating. The solution is not to say these leaders are what. The solution is to get 2 million people who vote for the ANC anyway to be very active, so that they can take back the country from the political party, because we still operate within the proportional representation system. So the issue of migration is also one of the biggest issues. One of the colleagues, his first as I've seen him here, he was talking a lot about what happened in Nigeria and how they kicked out the Ghanaians who were taking all the jobs, etc., and I sitting there. And so that's a very fascinating thing, given the xenophobic noises that you see in South Africa today. It's all about the values, right? Because when we say people are xenophobic, I was saying telling some colleagues last night, when you say xenophobic, don't look at people just as xenophobic. People who've got xenophobia, they also have other phobias, by the way. They also don't like gay people, they also don't like women, so it's related. You can tell me more about it because you are in that space of research. So you need to deal with the issue of conservatism and nationalism and patriotism that is actually negative to the development of society. So when we talk about that particular migration, it's a very fascinating thing. And I was saying to some people yesterday that, I don't know how many of you come from Zimbabwe here. Okay, so I don't know how good your history is. Do you guys know what happened in Southern Rhodesia, your former colonial name? In 1922, I don't remember what happened in 1922. You got grandparents or parents who may have told you the story of what happened in 1922 in Southern Rhodesia. Okay, so you see, the Zimbabwean people don't know the history. So here's what happened. The Prime Minister of South Africa at the time was one Jan Smuts, and South Africa was still under British colonial rule. And Jan Smuts got together with whoever was the king there. I think it must be one of the Georges, probably 5. George V or something like that. And they took a decision that they were going to unite South Africa and Southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe today. And that matter went to a referendum in Zimbabwe in 1922. And they lost 41-59. And today you want to talk about xenophobia. It just nearly became the same country. So we need to be very careful about always wanting to talk about borders, which are actually a colonial legacy. No African person was consulted on putting together a border. These borders are all figments of our imagination because someone wanted to put them there because they wanted to drive a particular agenda. But you don't need the borders. And so that's why we need to drive in a way that is very different to deal with the opportunity, not the border. Border's not going to give you any money. In fact, they've never done anything, these borders, for us as Africans in particular. Zero. Not a single empirical person can give me empirical evidence to suggest what a border has contributed. Nothing. So we are beholden to things that we don't necessarily need. And so very quickly, President, this idea, I'm not going to go into this, of agile governance, where we need to be very flexible, adaptable, and bring in the new young people who understand the things that need to be done. Too many of the regimes in Africa are being run by old people, and there's nothing wrong. I'm not an ageist myself. But too many old people, and as you can see, I don't know how you believe these 70-year-old and 80-year-old people who are running your governments are going to adapt around these new challenges. It's not going to happen. So it's time to allow the young people to be trained and developed, to be coached and mentored, so that they can step forward and they can play a meaningful role in taking our societies forward. Because otherwise we're going to get into serious trouble in respect of what's happening. And as we said, my former president was saying, Otin, yesterday, it's about the values, it's about the culture. It has to change. And we, in our context, we talk about 3 I's: intellect, integrity, and imagination. You can't have intellect without integrity. That integrity has in it the idea of discipline, because you can design whichever way, but you need to have the discipline to be able to do things and do them within the construct of what that level of integrity says you are going. So as you do research, you can't go unethical and produce information that seemingly serves a political agenda, but it does not actually have the level of integrity. That happens a lot. I'm not saying that happens with the organization, but we have picked up in business where data is shaped to give a particular agenda because the payer wanted that particular outcome. And it causes a lot of this noise, and it causes a lot of this lack of integrity. So when we try to imagine the world that we'd like to have, we can't imagine that particular world. Okay. So this is a very, very important in that particular regard to create that. Now, this fellow, Amartya Sen, most of you know him, Indian philosopher, economist, used to teach at Cambridge, Harvard, Oxford, all over the place. And he wrote this book called The Idea of Justice. Actually, before I talk about him, this other favorite author of mine called W.B. Yeats, he famously, President, wrote in the margin of his copy of a book by Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher. And the book was called On the Genealogy of Morals. And Nietzsche, because Nietzsche was complaining about the things that were going to happen at the beginning of the 20th century, the wars that were going to come and all sorts of things. And Yeats writes, why does Nietzsche think that the night has no stars, but only bats, owls, and the insane moon? And he was talking about this pessimism that was actually encompassed in what Nietzsche was actually talking about, instead of seeing things that were actually possible on what we can actually do. So the idea of justice is a very important idea because it talks about social justice. As we develop these economies, as we said earlier on, we can't leave all these masses of people behind because we believe that we can build economies without them. Slavery is out of the way. The oppression of women is out of the way. The oppression of people because they happen to be a different color is out of the way. So we need to build economies that are inclusive. Amartya Sen tells a very powerful story of 3 kids who are fighting over a flute. And their names are Anne, Bob, and Carla. And they are fighting over the ownership of the flute. Anne's contention, without disputing the claims of the other 2 kids, is as follows. She says, I should be the one who owns the flute. And the reason I should own the flute is because I am the one who can play it, and I am the one who is proficient in playing the flute. So I will derive maximum utility from its ownership. So she is making the argument of a utilitarian economist. Bob, on the other side, says, wait. I am the poorest of the 3 of us, and my family does not have any money. I will never have money to buy any other toy. So on that basis, I deserve to have the flute. And he is making the argument of an egalitarian economist. Kala, on the other side, says, wait, wasn't it my blood, sweat, and tears that made the flute? Therefore, should it not belong to me? And so she is making the argument of a libertarian economist. All 3 of these people are making valid contestations and claims. The difficulty that we have as society at that intersection of public policy, business, and society is that we decide to choose sides and want the one side to be more prominent than the other side instead of understanding that there is an orchestra that we need to conduct. So we need the intellectual depth and the academy that you are running as research organizations to help us, people in business, to be in front of the story so that we have the right levels of data and science that can enable us to be able to drive and take things forward. So in closing, Mr. President, there's another old African saying that says that birds sing not because they've got answers, but they sing because they've got songs. Birds sing not because they've got answers, they sing because they've got songs. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. You've given us a lot to think about. I'm sure we have a lot of questions from Alan. We will, after the whole session, have the speakers up here. I have a lot of questions, having worked in broadcasting half my life. And why is our state broadcaster holding up all that spectrum? Because when I worked there 20 years ago, we were working on DTT and moving from our analog to DTT. And then I went to ETV for another 10 years. And that was still happening. So we could have such cheap bandwidth if we could just get them to let go of that. Wonderful keynote address. Thank you.